So Nolita, I will take a pause here. I thought I will just explain the whole concept and construct of adaptability. We went through variety of thinking to arrive at this framework, and then take your inputs, and based on your guidance, which are the specific areas you will want to deep dive into. I will then cover a couple of those areas as per your request.
Thank you very much, Hashwan. It's very interesting, especially coming out from the crisis, how HR has been forced into the limelight. And what I take it is a really opportune time. It almost allows everybody to rebase, and those who can identify and capitalize on the opportunities can actually accelerate their transformation. So I think the most critical, always fundamental to me, is the number one. I always believe that there is always a balance between the commercial viability and the purpose of HR. You know, we do care for the well-being of the people, but it is also important that the well-being, the commercial viability and the growth of the organization is supported. And I also like the way that because the change begin with HR itself. So understanding where HR organizations, the pure 3-pillar HR model, is very interesting. I've just come from a global bank, of which they've moved away from the HRBP concept into a much more HR consultants. And I think you can get carried away with the names, but the responsibilities is what shifts to what they really do. And I think if I had to just take a top 3, I think HR, I love this: ambition in aspiration and humility in execution, because I think that really encompasses that you really want to take your alignment with the business strategy, and then you define what is the people and culture goals, and then you have to execute it. I'm one of those Shaswat that believe that I can never perfect a concept. It is the iterations that will get me to the highest point. So when you talk about all these things, everything is applicable, but because we have just embarked on, PNB has just defined its strategic priorities. And, one of it is diversification. We're an investment house, so we want to be world-class. So, they have a challenging job on where do they invest. So I think HR plays a role in getting the right talents, the processes for people. And our second one is in value creation. As a group, we want to not control the companies that are part of our family, but more to where do you leverage synergies? And you touched about it. How do you build connectivity to the communities outside, which includes companies that are related to you? And the third one actually is on governance. And this comes from risk. I'm a closet risk manager. I think you always have to evaluate between what is risk management and rewards. It should not make you shy away from seizing opportunities, but you take a prudent action. And the last one, and this is where my role comes in a lot, is we've put organizational transformation as one of the 4 pillars. And I think when you have that as your top line business strategy, you know that you've got alignment with the shareholders, your board, and your senior management. And within it, it actually deals a lot with people and culture. It deals a lot with digital first. It deals with governance. And I think ultimately it deals with a high performance organization and giving a KPI a better name. Sometimes KPI get a bad name because it's not a bad name. It's the implementation and the measurement of it, Shaswat, that gives it a bad name sometimes. So I think those would be the top 3 that I think resonates very harsh, very, very strongly with me based on where the business strategy is coming out to.
So perfectly. So I will actually talk more and sequence it, same things, but I will sequence it to connect to your statements. So first of all, why we said ambition in aspiration and humility in execution, Nurlida, is goes back to your point which you were making. And the point was that transformation is not for HR. And you said that your organization is saying we are going through an organization transformation, and that's core to the strategy. Reality is today, if you look at and talk to any business, and we have now a thumb rule, if you're talking to a Fortune 1000 firm, typically they will have 15, 18, 20 kind of business transformation projects on. And when you step back and look at each of those business transformation project, Norlida, to your point, it's about culture change. It's about moving to some new behavior. It's about, and behavior could be innovation, collaboration, and those kind of changes needed. It's about changing the whole performance and the impact which is being created pre and post transformation. And finally, it's about lot about organization change and job reconfiguration. So essentially, the moment a business enters into business transformation, you have created 18, 20 mega projects for HR. And while you may or may not call it HR projects, smart CEOs are realizing HR success will enable whether we succeed with this business transformation or not. So that's where many of the largest and most successful transformation projects are happening, where business leaders are saying this needs to go first so that we are ready for the rest. And that totally resonates with the statement you were making. And if you really look at it, to your point, the outcomes will be around these three. I'm just looking into why we said that we need ambition in aspiration and humility in execution. Goes back to the other comment you were making. One is, I think HR has undersold itself. So when you look at actually putting a goal out in there, most times HR will kind of underplay the commitment to business or to the larger stakeholders. Most successful transformations we see are the transformations where HR is going out and putting its stakes on the ground that this is what we want to do. It does a couple of things. It actually creates early business buying. The second point, Nolita, you were making is, to do that, you will need to be very clear about the value realization you are driving. So what's the real value which will excite business, whether it's around the talent and what are those talent problems which you solve for the business they really want to partner with you. How do you enable that collaboration, the impact? So the moment you are taking an approach of ambition in aspiration, you are getting anchored to clarity around value. And that's very important to me. In the planning stage is the most important aspect. And I will say at all stages of HR transformation, because value itself may change. So hypothetically, if we are part of an HR transformation journey and now COVID happened, all your old value stands true longer term, but you also need to deliver some short term values. And hence, value realization remains an ongoing conversation. And humility in execution connects to your other comment is, no solution is perfect. So, how do you build a DNA in HR to look at solutions coming in or data coming in and say, maybe what we thought was great needs to be tweaked further. This needs to be changed. And hence, you need far greater humility, and I will say less love for existing solutions, which typically is not the case or historically is not the case, because solutions were owned by functional silos and there was always this friction of saying that this is better and this needs to continue. So that's where, when this is less from research, when we pull all the research data and looked at our own experience of saying what needs to really happen across these three stages, we also said let's cut through all the noise, because obviously activities are too many, but what are the things to focus at minimum? This is what we landed in, and that's where we said it's really about ambition in aspiration and humility in execution, because you will never be perfect first time, to your point. So that's really the big canvas in which transformations are happening in HR. Now, what I will do, I will go to the point, and I will address it, because when you said governance from a compliance perspective and the risk perspective, that we call as compliance, and I will go to the governance later on. So essentially here, I will just spend a minute on point 4. Nordlita is the challenge of when you think of digital, the top two expectations from service delivery today are, and it's a very interesting one. Number one is employee experience. Number two is compliance. And to your point, compliance has become a stronger need than in past. And it's true because now whatever happens gets amplified. So the moment you put that risk in HR, it is no more an HR risk, it becomes a brand risk. And hence compliance is super important. Equally and even more important is employee experience. So how do you bridge this literally two contradictory requirements and make it work is really the success of how you configured your digital platforms. So in many ways, people think of employee experience as extreme empowerment. It should appear as extreme empowerment, but the reality is any empowerment has boundaries. How do you define those boundaries well and make that boundaries invisible behind your platform? The compliance should be a given, and it should be working with your platform and should be literally invisible to most people in 95-97% of the situation. Also, compliance should not be taking effort from HR. It should be happening on its own. When that stage is reached, you have really succeeded with the whole digital journey. Now, quickly moving to your comment around point 5, and I could not agree more with you. So our big heading is solve for collaboration. It's less important what roles you are thinking, because in many ways roles are bricks. What is more important is motor you create in HR, which is that's how you will build a wall that will hold together everything. So collaboration is key, and that's where more than roles and how those roles are defined, it's important to define the boundary of those roles so that role holders do not fight for the same customer. So for example, the worst thing which can happen is your HR business partner and COE leaders, for example, fighting for the attention of business leader. So how do you avoid that? So that's second point. The third point is a lot of people I say that's the biggest fallacy in HR. For 30 years or so, HR has been trying to move to a three-pillar model of HR. So what I mean by this is when the whole three-pillar model got created late 80s, early 90s, and then it gained traction, HR was moving away from administrative role to the whole model of business partnering, need to business partner, and that still continue. In many ways, it actually gave too much emphasis or only emphasis to business partnering. Somewhere, the whole notion that HR is also the custodian of employees, trusteeship of that, culture custodian was underplayed. And one of the reasons why field HR never disappeared as a role. So if you look at in our whole study over last 3 cycles, field HR remains a substantial part of HR organizations. And we may name it differently. Many organizations will call this HRBPs. And when you go and look at it, they are lower order HRBPs. The danger is then all the HRBPs are performing at way lower level than required, because it's easier to then do a generalist role and then to do an HRBP role. Similarly, a lot of organizations assume that HRBPs or field generalists and HR generalists are field HR or HR generalists are extension of HR operations, and over a period of time they will disappear as automation happens and there is more end-to-end services which is managed on mobile and all of that. So broadly it's true, because your transactions and HR operations will spread and will cover larger pie of HR work, but field HR role will still remain and will be unique. So smart organizations, Nordlida, are making this more contextual. So depending on their unique journey, they will use field HR role to their advantage. Some of the more, I will say, advanced organizations are now becoming clear to say that employment relationship and employment bond is important. So how do you reconfigure this fourth pillar? Because if you are going to compete on culture, the value of the organization, then really HR needs to build this whole trust with employees beyond the value being created for business. And that's where this role fits in. So this role is fluid and is evolving. But over a period of time, it will kind of come together more around employment relationship, bond, culture, and those anchors. I will broadly talk through this, the way to look for HR roles. So this is what we call an square pie and how to cut it, Nordlida. It's a very simple one. Think of x-axis as what can be standardized in HR from a process and delivery perspective. And then y-axis, think of predictability of output. As you think of the two axes, strategy and design is classically your COE role. So these are in-house consultants who are designing programs, solving things for you. If you look at the extreme right, which is really processes which are standardized and outputs are predictable, that's really HR operations. And over a period of time, larger part can be moved to HR operations and so on. Now, the middle zone is the problem solving zone. So that's where when you look at the gray zone, to us it's very clear that's HRBP, closer to strategy and design, but using it to problem solve for business. And essentially, and you were kind of alluding to it, Norlida, is HRBP we are saying is it's a business performance consultant role. So how do you look at culture, capability, performance itself, look at productivity, employee motivation, all of that to say how business can perform better, compete better, what it takes to make it happen. And the moment you think of that lens, then HRBP as a role does not go very deep from a layers and a numbers perspective. It will need to marry the business structure and end at a level where the strategy in the business side ends, because that's where you are mapping your talent strategy and kind of solving those problems to the business strategy in the firm. So if you think of your investment business, there are certain parts of investment business which is old and which will be really large, and you will have made a lesser number of HRBPs given the size of the business versus something new and getting incubated. While the scale may not be there, even day one they may need an HRBP to kind of think of HR and people aspects as they scale up that business. The blue zone, which is employee and manager relationship, solving their day-to-day problems, giving them counseling guidance, is really the role of field HR or HR generalist. I just thought that this should connect well with some of the talking points you were saying. And the last point on this, Nolita, from my end is trust and organization change continuously is gaining as requirements across HR roles. So if you think of collaboration as the big ask, then it's natural that trust will come up high. So in HRBP, trust-based relationship is coming up because they need to gain trust of business, and only then the partnering will happen. If you think of center of excellence, facilitating change is the one which will continue to go up, and strategic thinking more than any functional skills, because a great COE leader today is not someone who is doing design in ivory tower, but to your earlier comment is able to not only design but to understand the requirements, tweak design, and really ensure the successful deployment of that design. That also connects to the whole pillar of adoption at heart. And similarly, when you look at HR operations, you will see analytics orientation, and you will again see emergence of things like build trust-based relations and so on, because your HR operations will have end-to-end view of the data. So if they have the end-to-end view of the data, how do they influence change around that will depend on do they enjoy the trust and kind of confidence of their HR peers to drive that change. So there is a lot more detail around it. Happy to discuss this some other time. So that's really the whole piece around three-pillar model of HR and so on. Last piece, and Nordita, this goes back to your theme around HR needs to really come out and drive change, is connected to our adaptability framework earlier. We looked at the data even further in deep to say that if organizations which are outliers are moving ahead, what is making them move ahead? Really, if you ask me, the whole anchor of this change and the speed in those organizations around their HR is coming from their ability to partner and solve problems on an ongoing basis. So what they do best is they have a clearly defined HR governance model within HR and with business. So here when we say governance, it's your cadence of HRBP sitting with business without any other defined agenda to say that where is your business going, core items of business strategy. This is what our connected talent strategy was. This is how data is telling us about our progress to that strategy. These things we are doing well. These are the gaps. Potentially, these are the solutions by which we can cover this gap. Get a buy-in onto those solutions. Come back, try to then discuss and kind of unpack those solutions with HR, other HR leaders. So, right, COE leaders, HR operation leaders, implement that. Look at data coming out to say whether that's working, and again go back in conversation with business. So this is really the classical cycle of and working and fully functional HR governance. Looks very much like an agile model from a today's day and age and lingo perspective, but reality is great firms have been doing it for 10, 12, 15 years. And what it does is it switches HR to an ongoing behavior which is outside it. It also changes the ways of working in HR, Nolita, to your earlier comment, and makes some of the structural and those definitions less relevant, because you are anyhow working and trying to identify problem and problem solve that, drive change and adoption around that. And then your roles are fungible, because then you are moving beyond your roles to make it happen. And to us, that's a very critical insight. And this is what is making these organizations pull ahead from the rest of the organizations. So that's it from my end, Nordlida. I hope I have covered some of the points which you mentioned.
Thank you very much. I can see the context of your study and into the journey of the people agenda for us. Thank you.
So, Nordlida, I have not grown in my life. I've been doing HR transformation for 20 years, since 2001. So I better know this subject well enough.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Shashwat. That is indeed covered very, very concisely and crisply. And I think my key takeaway was about how even Nolita pointed out how ambition and aspiration and humility in execution is a key to a successful HR transformation. So very, very great point made there. I'm sure there's a lot to learn. The study is really extensive. And for our viewers, if they could read through the study, they'll get to learn a lot more about their own HR transformation journeys.